Okay, so today we're going deep, really deep, into something pretty big and honestly often really misunderstood, the pro-life perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
And we're talking about the philosophical, foundational arguments, the stuff that really drives this whole viewpoint.
Exactly, the core beliefs.
Right. And we want to do this for our listeners,
Yeah.
the folks who want to really grasp it all, but maybe don't have all day.
Right. Efficiently is key.
Exactly. So we've got all these sources, right? Like a whole bunch covering ethics, religion, science, history, you name it.
It's a lot to unpack, but it's all connected.
It is. And our goal here, our mission, is to pull it all apart, right? See how the pro-life stance is built, brick by brick, based on all this stuff.
Yeah, lay it all out there. The principles, the reasoning, the whole deal.
Exactly. But, and this is important, this is super personal for a lot of people, right? Like strong convictions, diverse viewpoints, the whole nine yards.
Definitely. A lot of passion on all sides.
Yeah, for sure. So knowing that, let's dive in. Where do we even start with the philosophy of all this, the ideas behind it all?
Okay, well, if you're talking pro-life, the absolute bedrock, the starting point, is the sanctity of human life.
Okay, sanctity of human life. That's a big one.
It is. And it means, at its core, that from the very moment of conception, like right then and there, every human being, no matter what stage of development, has inherent dignity.
Inherent dignity. So not earned, not based on anything, just there.
Exactly. Just by existing. And with that dignity comes moral worth. Like every life is inherently valuable, deserves protection.
So where does this conviction about inherent dignity come from? What's driving that within this pro-life framework?
Well, a lot of it, especially for those coming from a Christian perspective, comes from this idea of imago Dei.
Imago Dei, I've heard that before.
Yeah, it's from Genesis in the Bible, 1.2627. And it basically means humans are created in the image of God.
Okay, right. Like a reflection of God in every person.
Exactly. But it's not just like a stamp of approval or something. It's way deeper. It means every human life, every single one from the very beginning, reflects something fundamental about God.
So each life is irreplaceable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Invaluable. You can't put a price on it. Can't say one is worth more than another. They all reflect the divine, And so from this perspective, taking a human life, especially an innocent one, that's a huge moral problem.
That's where the view of abortion as morally wrong comes in.
Right, exactly. If all human life is sacred from conception, then abortion is taking an innocent human life.
Okay, so that's a big part of it, the religious foundation. But how does this pro-life argument work outside of just religious circles? How does it connect with broader society, broader ethics?
So that's where the human rights argument comes in. Like the pro-life movement, we lean hard on the idea of universal human rights. We say a fetus is a developing human, right?
Right, growing and changing all the time.
Exactly. And we believe they should have the same fundamental rights as anyone else, especially the most basic one, the right to life.
Makes sense. Everyone deserves a chance to live.
That's the idea. And a lot of this thinking, this human rights argument, it goes back to this thing called natural law theory.
Natural law theory. Now that sounds a bit complex.
It can be, yeah. But the gist is this. There are certain moral truths that exist just naturally in the universe, in the way things are. And you can figure those truths out using reason, using your mind.
So it's not about rules written down somewhere, but just inherent truths.
Right. And the right to life, that's seen as one of those self-evident truths. Like everyone has the right to exist, period.
Yeah.
It's universal, applies to all humans, no exception.
Including those in the womb.
Exactly. And this natural law idea, it gets pretty deep. It connects to a lot of philosophical thinking about morality, about the basis of our laws.
Interesting. Now, the sources also mentioned something about constitutional arguments being used by the pro-life movement. How does that fit in?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Especially in the U.S., pro-life advocates will often point to the Constitution, specifically the 5th and 14th Amendments.
Right. Those are about due process and equal protection under the law.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the argument is basically those amendments are supposed to protect everyone from being deprived of life without a fair legal process.
And they extend that to the unborn.
Exactly. They say, look, if those protections are supposed to be fundamental, then they should apply to everyone, including the unborn.
Because the unborn, in their view, are people too, entitled to those same rights.
Right. And that's where it gets really tied up with legal debates about when life begins, when personhood begins.
Right, when those constitutional protections should kick in.
Exactly. It gets very complex, very nuanced legally.
For sure. Now, there was this other term that came up, consistent life ethic.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. It's not just about abortion. It's kind of like this umbrella philosophy,
Oh, yeah, like a broader view of how to protect life.
Right. It's this idea that if you're truly pro-life, you should be consistently advocating for the protection of all human life at every stage, in every situation.
So not just abortion, but also things like,
Euthanasia, assisted suicide, even capital punishment, and some would even say against unjust war.
wow, so it's like a whole spectrum of issues.
It is. And it's about recognizing the inherent dignity of human life in all its forms, from conception to natural death, and opposing anything that threatens that dignity.
Interesting. So it's not that everyone who identifies as pro-life necessarily subscribes to this whole consistent life ethic, right?
Right. It's more like a philosophy that some people hold within the broader movement. But it definitely highlights this deep commitment to protecting life across the board.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, something else that popped up in the sources was this idea of moral foundations theory. How does that help us understand the pro-life view?
So moral foundations theory, it's a bit of a psychological thing. It basically says that as humans, we have these like built-in moral instincts, like these foundational ways of thinking about right and wrong.
Okay, like moral gut feelings almost.
Yeah, kind of. And one of those foundations is this idea of purity or sanctity. It's all
Yeah.
about having reverence for things that are considered sacred.
And for the pro-life view, that sacred thing would be.
Human life? Absolutely. Innocent human life especially. And anything that violates that sanctity, like abortion, is seen as morally wrong, almost like a defilement.
I see. So it's not just about logic or arguments, but also about this deep-seated feeling of what's right and wrong.
Right. And then there are other moral foundations, like loyalty, authority, tradition. Those can also play a role in strengthening pro-life beliefs.
How so?
Well, think about it. Loyalty to your family, your community, wanting to protect them, especially the most vulnerable, like unborn children, that ties into pro-life thinking. And then respect for authority, for tradition, for the way things have always been done, that can also reinforce those beliefs.
Makes sense. People often draw on those values to support their views on life and family.
Right. So moral foundations theory, it's a way of understanding why people feel so strongly about this issue. It's not just intellectual, it's emotional, it's visceral.
It's about deeply held values and gut feelings about what's right and wrong.
Exactly. And that's really important to remember when we're talking about something as sensitive and complex as abortion.
Absolutely. Now, we keep circling back to this idea of natural law philosophy. It seems to be a pretty significant framework for the pro-life argument. Can we unpack that a little more?
Sure. So natural law, it's this idea that there are moral principles woven into the fabric of the universe, like built into how things are. And these principles, they're not invented by humans, they're just there.
Okay, so it's like a universal moral code that exists independently of us.
Right. And the key is these principles are accessible through human reason. So by using our minds, we can discover these truths, these moral laws.
And how does abortion fit into this natural law framework?
So from a pro-life perspective, abortion is seen as a direct violation of natural law because, they argue, it's unjustly ending an innocent human life. It's interrupting this natural process of development, the unfolding of human potential, which is seen as inherently good and valuable.
So it's not just about a religious belief, but also a philosophical one based on reason and an understanding of the natural order.
Exactly. And this natural law idea, it goes way back in philosophy, like ancient Greece, all the way through to today.
Hmm.
It's been used to justify all sorts of moral and legal arguments, not just about abortion.
Interesting. It seems to be a pretty powerful framework for thinking about right and wrong, about what our laws should be based on.
It is. And it's one that the pro-life movement draws on heavily to make their case.
Now, one thing that struck me in the sources was this connection between opposition to abortion and broader social justice concerns. Tell me more about that historical dimension.
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? Especially early on in the pro-life movement, a lot of the activists, they saw a direct link between opposing abortion and fighting for other social justice causes.
Okay, like seeing it all as interconnected.
Exactly. They were like, look, if we're talking about protecting the vulnerable, that includes unborn children, but it also includes people suffering from poverty, racism, all sorts of injustice. It was all part of the same fight for them.
So defending the unborn wasn't just about abortion, it was about building a more just and compassionate society overall.
Exactly. They saw it as this fundamental right, the right to life, that everything else depended on.
And that protecting that right for the unborn was part of a bigger picture of fighting for human dignity for everyone.
Right. And it's interesting because that connection to social justice, it's still there in the pro-life movement today, but it maybe doesn't get as much attention.
It's probably a complex relationship historically and currently.
Oh, for sure. There are all sorts of debates and nuances within the movement about how those issues intersect, how to prioritize them.
Makes sense. It's a big, multifaceted issue. So how did the modern pro-life movement, as we know it today, actually come about? When did it start gaining momentum?
Well, it really coalesced as a movement in response to the push for abortion legalization back in the mid-20th century. Like, as that movement grew stronger, so did the opposition.
People felt like they had to stand up and fight for what they believed in.
Exactly. And they started framing their opposition as a human rights issue. They drew on constitutional law, natural law, even international declarations like the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Trying to give their arguments weight and legitimacy.
Exactly. And then, of course, there was Roe v. Wade in 1973.
Right, the Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion nationwide in the U.S.
That was a huge turning point.
Yeah.
It galvanized the pro-life movement, made it way more politically active, and it's been fighting ever since to restrict abortion access and ultimately to overturn Roe.
They saw it as a grave injustice, a denial of fundamental rights.
Exactly. And that's where we are today, still grappling with this incredibly complex and emotionally charged issue.
Absolutely. Now, at the very heart of this debate, there's this fundamental conflict between the pro-life and pro-choice perspectives. What's the core of that conflict from the pro-life viewpoint?
So the pro-life stance, it all boils down to this: the right to life of the fetus versus the right to bodily autonomy of the woman.
That's the clash, right? Two fundamental rights seemingly at odds.
Right. And for pro-life advocates, the fetus's right to life, that's paramount. It trumps everything else. They believe it's the most fundamental right, the prerequisite for all other rights.
So even more important than the woman's right to choose what happens to her own body.
That's their argument. And it's often rooted in deontological ethics, which is basically the idea that certain moral duties are absolute no matter what.
Like the duty to protect innocent life.
Exactly. And in this case, that duty, that moral obligation, outweighs any considerations of individual freedoms or potential consequences.
It's about sticking to a principle no matter what.
Right. And that's where the conflict really heats up. Because the pro-choice side will obviously argue that the woman's autonomy, her right to control her own body, is equally fundamental, equally important.
Right. And that denying her that right is a huge injustice.
Exactly. So you've got these two deeply held principles, two fundamental rights clashing head on. And that's why this debate is so intense, so difficult to resolve.
Okay, so we've delved pretty deep into the philosophical arguments here. Now, let's shift gears a bit and look at the biblical foundations. Our sources really emphasized how important Scripture is in shaping the pro-life stance.
Oh, absolutely. Scripture is like the bedrock for a lot of pro-life arguments. It provides the moral framework, the theological justification for their position.
And it all goes back to that idea we talked about earlier, the imago Dei, right?
Exactly. That concept of humanity being created in God's image, that's central to the whole biblical pro-life argument. It gives every human life, including the unborn, intrinsic worth and dignity in the eyes of God.
And it's not just about imago Dei, right? There are other passages that are often cited.
Right, like Genesis 9.6, which forbids taking human life because humans are made in God's image. Pro-life advocates say that applies to the unborn, too.
It's about extending that protection to all stages of human life.
Exactly. And then you have passages that talk about God's direct involvement in the womb, like Psalm 139, where it talks about God knitting us together in our mother's womb.
That's a powerful image, right? God actively shaping life from its very beginning.
It is, and pro-life advocates use that to say, look, this isn't just a clump of cells. It's a developing human being under God's care.
It has value and purpose from the very start.
Right. And they also point to Jeremiah 1.5, where God says he knew Jeremiah before he was formed in the womb. That's used to emphasize that God has a plan for each individual, even before birth.
So life has meaning and purpose from the moment of conception.
Exactly. And that's why abortion is seen as such a grave sin, because it's interfering with God's plan, with God's creation.
It's about respecting the sanctity of life, which is ultimately in God's hands.
Right. And then, of course, you have the Ten Commandments, specifically the Sixth Commandment, thou shalt not murder.
That's a pretty straightforward one.
It is. And pro-life advocates interpret it very literally. They say, look, this is a clear prohibition against taking innocent human life, and that includes the unborn.
Because they believe life begins at conception, and therefore abortion is murder.
Exactly. It's all tied together. Their beliefs about when life begins, their interpretation of Scripture, their view of morality.
Makes sense. Now, the New Testament also gets brought into this conversation, right?
Yeah, definitely. There are passages that pro-life advocates point to as evidence for fetal personhood, like the story in Luke 1.4144, where John the Baptist leaps in Elizabeth's womb when Mary, who's pregnant with Jesus, comes to visit.
They see that as a sign of life, of awareness, even in the womb.
Right, exactly. And then you have Galatians 1.15, where Paul says that God set him apart from his mother's womb. They see that as further evidence that God knows and has a plan for individuals even before they're born.
It's about recognizing the personhood of the unborn, even in the earliest stages of development.
Exactly. And it's not just about specific verses, it's also about the overall message of the Bible, the emphasis on the sanctity of life, on caring for the vulnerable.
It's about seeing the unborn as part of that category, worthy of protection and care.
Right. And it's interesting to note that this view of abortion as wrong, it goes way back in Christian history.
Right, it's not just a modern invention.
Nope. Early Christian writings, like the Didache, which dates back to the 1st century, it condemns abortion. And you have church fathers like Tertullian, Basil, Jerome, all writing against abortion, saying it's the taking of a human life.
So there's a long tradition within Christianity of opposing abortion, rooted in Scripture and early teachings.
Absolutely. It's a core part of their moral framework, their understanding of what it means to be pro-life.
Okay, so we've seen how the pro-life perspective draws on Scripture, on specific passages and broader themes to support their arguments. When you bring it all together, what are the key theological concepts at play here?
Well, first and foremost, it's that idea of inherent human dignity. Remember, Imago Dei, that's the foundation. It's the belief that everyone is created in God's image and therefore has intrinsic worth and dignity, regardless of age, ability, or stage of development.
So even the unborn have that dignity, that worthiness of protection.
Exactly. And then you have the concept of divine sovereignty over life. That's the idea that God is the ultimate creator and sustainer of life, and that abortion is essentially usurping God's authority. It's taking something that belongs to God, that's sacred, and making a decision about it that only God should make.
It's about respecting God's role in creating and sustaining life.
Right. And finally, you have the concept of moral responsibility. That's the idea that we as humans have a duty to care for the vulnerable, to protect those who can't protect themselves.
And they see the unborn as the ultimate vulnerable population.
Exactly. They're completely dependent on others for their survival.
Huh.
And so pro-life advocates feel a strong moral obligation to protect them, to speak up for them.
It's about recognizing the inherent worth of every human life, from conception to natural death, and acting accordingly.
Exactly. That's the core of their theological argument against abortion.
Now, I know some people argue that the Bible doesn't explicitly mention abortion, at least not in the way we understand it today. How does the pro-life perspective address that?
That's true. There's no verse that says, "Thou shalt not have an abortion." And some critics point to passages like Genesis 2.7, where God breathes life into Adam, as suggesting that life begins at breath, not conception.
So they're using those passages to challenge the pro-life interpretation.
Right. But pro-life advocates respond by saying, look, you can't just take one verse in isolation. You have to look at the bigger picture, the overall message of the Bible. And that message, they argue, is about the sanctity of life, about God's involvement in creation from the very beginning.
So they're emphasizing those broader themes.
Exactly. And they say, when you consider those themes, the prohibition against killing, the value placed on human life, it becomes clear that abortion is wrong, even if it's not explicitly mentioned.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about interpreting the Bible in a holistic way, looking at the forest, not just the trees.
Right. And they believe that when you do that, the pro-life stance is firmly rooted in Scripture.
Now let's turn to the scientific and philosophical side of things. The question of when human life begins, that's central to this whole debate.
Absolutely. It's where science meets ethics, where biology meets philosophy. It's a really fascinating and complex intersection.
So from a purely scientific standpoint, what can we definitively say about when human life begins?
Okay, so scientifically, it's clear that the process of human development begins at fertilization. That's when the sperm and egg fuse, creating a zygote, a single-celled organism with its own unique DNA.
So that's the starting point, biologically speaking.
Right. And from that point on, there's a continuous process of development, from zygote to blastocyst, to embryo, to fetus. And during this process, all sorts of amazing things happen. Organs form, the heart starts beating, brain waves can be detected.
It's a remarkable journey, scientifically speaking.
It really is. But the thing is, while science can describe this process in great detail, it can't tell us when that developing life becomes morally significant.
Right, that's where ethics and philosophy come in.
Exactly. Because science can't answer questions like, when does personhood begin? When does that developing organism acquire rights? Those are questions about values, about what we consider important, about how we define what it means to be human.
And different people will have different answers to those questions based on their worldview, their beliefs.
Absolutely. So you have some people who say, life begins at conception, period. That's when a new human being comes into existence with all the rights that entails.
Others might point to different milestones, like the heartbeat or brain activity or viability outside the womb.
Right. And they'll argue that those are the points where moral status is acquired, where the developing organism becomes worthy of protection.
So it's not just about the science, it's about what we make of the science, how we interpret it through our ethical and philosophical lenses.
Exactly. And that's why this debate is so complex, so nuanced. It's not just about facts. It's about values, about beliefs, about what it means to be human.
Now, how does the theological perspective approach this question of when life begins? We've talked a lot about the Christian view, so let's focus on that.
So for many Christians, the belief is that human life is sacred and begins at conception. And this is often tied to the idea of the soul.
Right, that there's a soul present from the very beginning.
Exactly. And they'll often cite passages like Psalm 139, which talks about God forming us in the womb as evidence for this belief.
So they see God as actively involved in creating life from the moment of conception.
Right. And that gives that life inherent value in their eyes.
Now, the concept of personhood also comes up a lot in these discussions. What's the pro-life perspective on that?
So personhood, it's a tricky concept. It's about, what makes someone a person, worthy of moral consideration and legal protection.
Right, what qualities or characteristics are necessary for personhood?
Exactly. And there are lots of different views on this. Some people say it's about consciousness, self-awareness, the ability to reason. Others say it's about relationships, about being part of a community.
Then where does the pro-life view fall on this spectrum?
Well, they generally believe that personhood begins at conception. They say, look, this is a new human being with its own unique DNA, its own potential to develop into a fully functioning person.
So even though those characteristics of personhood might not be fully developed yet, they're still there in potential.
Exactly. And for them, that potential is enough to grant full moral status and the right to life.
So it all comes back to their belief that life begins at conception and that life is inherently valuable and worthy of protection.
Right. And they'll often argue that even if you're not sure when personhood begins, it's better to err on the side of caution to protect that life just in case.
It's about avoiding the risk of harming a being that might have moral status.
Exactly. They see it as a matter of basic human decency, of respecting the potential for life.
Okay, so we've seen how the pro-life perspective tackles the question of when life begins from scientific, philosophical, and theological angles. Now, let's talk about another key aspect, the value of human life itself. That seems to be at the very core of their position.
It is. It's the bedrock, the foundation upon which all their other arguments rest.
And we've already touched on some of the reasons why they believe human life is so valuable, right?
Right, the imago Dei, the idea that we're created in God's image, that gives us inherent dignity and worth.
And the belief that life begins at conception, that even the unborn are fully human and therefore deserve protection.
Exactly. And you can add to that the belief that life is a gift from God, a sacred trust.
So it's not just about biology, it's about something deeper, something spiritual.
Right. It's about recognizing the inherent value of every human life, regardless of its circumstances, its stage of development, its abilities.
And the pro-life perspective extends that recognition to the unborn.
Absolutely. They see the unborn as fully human, deserving of the same rights and protections as any other person.
Now, what's the pro-choice counter-argument to this view?
Well, they often challenge the claim that the unborn have full moral status or personhood from the moment of conception. They might acknowledge that the fetus is biologically human, but they argue that it doesn't necessarily have the same rights as a born person.
They might say personhood develops gradually, or it's dependent on certain capabilities.
Right, like consciousness, self-awareness, the ability to experience pain, and they often emphasize the woman's right to bodily autonomy, her right to make decisions about her own body.
So it becomes a question of balancing those rights, the right to life of the fetus versus the right to bodily autonomy of the woman.
Exactly. And that's the crux of the debate. It's a very difficult and nuanced issue with no easy answers.
Now, pro-life advocates often turn to scripture to support their view of the value of unborn life, right?
Oh, absolutely. Passages like Psalm 139 and Jeremiah 1.5,
Right.
which talk about God knowing and forming us in the womb, those are key.
They use those to argue that unborn life is not just potential, it's already valuable and cherished by God.
Right. And they also point to the consistent condemnation of abortion in early Christian writings, as we talked about earlier.
Showing that this view has deep roots in Christian tradition.
Exactly. It's not just a modern interpretation. It's been a core belief for centuries.
So while there might be some debate within Christianity about the specifics of when personhood begins, the overall emphasis is on the sanctity of life, on the inherent value of every human being.
Absolutely. And that's what drives the pro-life perspective. It's the foundation of their arguments, their beliefs, their actions.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. It's been a truly fascinating and challenging exploration of the pro-life perspective, digging into the philosophical, biblical, scientific, and ethical arguments that underpin their viewpoint.
It's a complex issue for sure. But I think we've done a good job of laying out the core beliefs and reasoning behind this stance.
And it all comes back to that fundamental principle, the inherent dignity and moral worth of every human life from the moment of conception.
Exactly. And that belief, it informs everything else, the way they interpret scripture, the way they view science, the way they engage in this debate.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about, a lot to grapple with.
It does, and that's what we want, right? To spark thoughtful discussion, to encourage people to really engage with this issue on a deep level.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought. We've looked at all these different arguments, these different perspectives on the value of human life. Now, we want you to reflect on what resonates most with you, what speaks to your own understanding of this complex issue, and why. What makes that particular aspect so compelling? We encourage you to continue this exploration, to delve deeper into the areas that pique your interest, and to engage in thoughtful dialogue with others who hold different views. This is a conversation that deserves our full attention, our compassion, and our willingness to listen and learn from each other.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's been a pleasure having you, and to our listeners, thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.